In the final months of World War II, from late 1944 to the middle of 1945, Japan's cities began to starve. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Yokohama, once bustling centers of industry and commerce, were brought to their knees by a silent enemy far out at sea. The U.S. Navy's submarine force, spread across the vast Pacific, carried out a campaign that would choke Japan's ability to fight. By striking at the lifeblood of the empire, its merchant shipping, the submarines cut off food, fuel, and raw materials. This was not a sudden blow, but a tightening noose. Ship by ship, convoy by convoy, Japan's supply lines vanished beneath the waves. The strategy was simple but devastating. Japan depended on imported resources to wage war. Oil came from the Dutch East Indies, rice and other food from Southeast Asia, and rubber, coal, and iron ore from territories scattered across the Pacific. Without these, factories would stop, planes would remain grounded, and soldiers would go hungry. American submarines targeted these lifelines. The campaign was methodical, built on patience and planning. By early 1945, over 80% of Japan's merchant fleet was gone, sunk, or crippled. Technically, the U.S. submarines were built for long, dangerous missions. The Gado-class and Balao-class submarines formed the core of this force. Each vessel carried torpedoes, a deck gun, and advanced radar. Early in the war, their torpedoes had been plagued by problems. They ran too deep, failed to explode, or detonated too early. By 1944, these issues were fixed. Submarines now struck with deadly precision. Crews received intelligence from codebreakers who had cracked Japanese naval codes. This allowed the Americans to predict convoy routes and plan ambushes before a single ship left port. At sea, the submarines hunted in groups called wolf packs. They stalked convoys under cover of darkness. Radar guided them through storms and darkness, while sonar helped them track ships beneath the surface. When an attack came, it was sudden and violent. A single submarine might fire a spread of torpedoes at multiple targets, aiming to sink cargo ships and tankers first. Japanese escort ships fought back with depth charges, rolling them over the sides in hopes of hitting a submerged attacker. One night in early 1945, a convoy leaving Shanghai crossed paths with a pack of American subs. In the black waters of the East China Sea, torpedoes raced toward their targets. Explosions ripped through the convoy. Tankers carrying fuel for Japanese planes went up in fireballs that lit the sky. Cargo ships laden with food and coal broke apart and sank. As the survivors scrambled for lifeboats, Japanese destroyers raced to retaliate. Depth charges thundered through the water, shaking the submarines as they dove deep and went silent. For hours, the crews lay motionless in the dark, sweating in the stale air, waiting for the enemy to give up. When dawn came, the sea was littered with debris, oil slicks, and the bodies of those lost. As the blockade tightened, Japan's attempts to defend its shipping grew desperate. The Navy converted fishing boats and civilian vessels into makeshift escorts. These lightly armed ships were no match for the well-trained American crews. By this point, the Battle of the Philippine Sea had already destroyed much of Japan's carrier force. With no air cover and dwindling fuel, Japanese convoys were easy prey. Back home, the impact of the blockade was severe. Rice became scarce in Tokyo. In Osaka, families lined up for meager rations that grew smaller each week. Markets turned into scenes of quiet desperation. Mothers searched for food while children suffered from malnutrition. The government encouraged citizens to grow vegetables in every available space. But it was not enough. Famine spread through the cities, while rural areas struggled to support themselves. The military felt the strain as well. Army units stationed in China and the Pacific Islands found themselves cut off. Supplies of ammunition, medicine, and food dwindled. Soldiers resorted to eating whatever they could find. Some units abandoned their posts, unable to continue fighting without basic resources. On the other side of the Pacific, American submarine crews endured their own hardships. Life aboard a submarine was cramped and dangerous. Men lived in narrow bunks stacked like shelves. The air was hot, heavy with diesel fumes, and filled with the constant thrum of machinery. Missions lasted weeks, sometimes months. with no chance to see daylight or breathe fresh air. Each dive brought the risk of never resurfacing. Yet the crews pressed on, knowing their actions were slowly bringing Japan to its knees. Every successful attack carried a weight. The crews knew that many of the ships they sank carried not only soldiers and weapons, but also civilians and workers. After a night of combat, silence often filled the submarine's mess hall as men thought about the lives lost in the dark waters. War demanded these actions, but it did not make them easy. By the spring of 1945, Japan's economy was collapsing. Factories stood idle without coal or steel. Power shortages became common. Oil reserves were nearly gone, leaving planes grounded and ships unable to sail. Even the military could not escape the consequences. Tank divisions lacked fuel, and airfields stood empty. The blockade had done more than sink ships. It had isolated an entire nation. Japan's strategy had relied on expansion, using conquered territories to fuel its war machine. Once those connections were severed, there was no way to replace them. The empire that had stretched across the Pacific now found itself alone and starving, with no path forward. The submarines, silent and unseen, had achieved what no army on land could. They had strangled Japan's war effort at its source, leaving the cities vulnerable and the people hungry. In the space of a few months, they turned the tide of the war, setting the stage for the final battles that would bring the conflict to an end. American submarines were built for long campaigns deep in enemy waters. They operated far from home, cut off from support, and relied on skill and precision to survive. By late 1944, the U.S. submarine fleet in the Pacific had become a highly organized force. The backbone of this fleet was the Gado-class and Balao-class submarines. These boats were designed for endurance, able to stay at sea for weeks at a time while carrying enough torpedoes and supplies to strike repeatedly. Each submarine carried a crew of around 80 men. Space was tight and conditions were harsh. The boats were armed with deck guns for surface combat, but their main weapon was the torpedo. At the start of the war, American torpedoes were plagued with defects. The Mark 14 torpedo often ran too deep or failed to detonate. For nearly 2 years, crews risked their lives only to watch their shots miss or bounce harmlessly off enemy hulls. This problem was finally corrected by mid-1943. By the time the final stage of the war began, the torpedoes were reliable, powerful, and accurate. Radar was another key improvement. Early in the war, submarines relied on lookouts scanning the horizon with binoculars. By 1944, they had radar systems that allowed them to track enemy ships at night or in heavy weather. This gave the Americans a critical edge. Japanese convoys often moved under cover of darkness, believing night would shield them. Radar stripped away that advantage. Submarines rarely worked alone. They were organized into groups called wolf packs, modeled after the tactics used by German U-boats in the Atlantic. A wolf pack might consist of 3 or 4 submarines, coordinating their movements by radio. When one boat located a convoy, it would shadow the enemy and call in the others. The submarines would then strike together, hitting the convoy from different angles. This tactic overwhelmed Japanese defenses, which were already thin. Japan lacked enough escort ships to protect its merchant fleet. Many of its destroyers had been lost in earlier battles and could not be replaced quickly. Smaller vessels, like converted fishing boats and patrol craft, were pressed into service. These makeshift escorts carried light weapons and depth charges, but they lacked sonar and were often poorly trained. Japanese air patrols were also limited. Without strong protection from the air, convoys became easy targets. American submarines focused on specific cargo. Oil was the most critical target. Japan's Navy and Air Force depended on fuel imported from the Dutch East Indies. Without oil, planes could not fly and ships could not sail. Submarines also targeted ships carrying food, especially rice from Southeast Asia, as well as coal, rubber, and iron ore. Each sinking had a direct impact on Japan's war effort. A single lost tanker might ground dozens of aircraft or leave an entire fleet idle. The submarine campaign was not random. It was carefully planned with intelligence gathered by U.S. Navy codebreakers. American cryptographers had broken Japanese naval codes early in the war. By 1944, this intelligence was being used to guide submarine operations. Messages intercepted from Japanese headquarters revealed when and where convoys would move. Commanders received this information before they set out, allowing them to plan ambushes. This system made the blockade far more effective. Submarines no longer had to search aimlessly across thousands of miles of ocean. Instead, they could take up positions along known shipping routes, lying in wait like hunters at a waterhole. When a convoy approached, the submarines were already in position. The Japanese never realized how much their communications had been compromised, and their losses mounted month by month. By early 1945, the results were catastrophic for Japan. More than 80% of its merchant fleet was gone. Tankers were especially hard hit. Some routes had become so dangerous that merchant crews refused to sail without heavy escort. Even with protection, many convoys never reached their destinations. The few ships that survived were forced to take long, indirect routes to avoid known danger zones, which delayed deliveries and consumed precious fuel. An example of how this worked can be seen in the waters around the South China Sea. Japanese convoys moving between the Philippines and the home islands faced constant attack. Submarines tracked them using radar and intelligence reports. At night, the wolf packs would strike. Torpedoes exploded beneath tankers and freighters, sending fire and smoke into the sky. Survivors clung to wreckage as escort ships dropped depth charges, trying to hit the submarines lurking below. The Americans would dive deep and wait, silent and still, while the explosions rumbled overhead. Once the escorts gave up and moved on, the submarines rose again to finish the job. The loss of so many ships had a ripple effect throughout Japan's war machine. Factories could not run without coal and raw materials. Weapons production slowed. Food shortages grew worse as rice shipments from the colonies stopped arriving. Oil became so scarce that entire fleets stayed in port. Even training flights for pilots were cut back because there was no fuel to spare. American submarines sank enemy ships at a rate Japan could not replace. By 1945, new construction could no longer keep up with losses. The blockade had reached a point where even desperate measures could not save the merchant fleet. Japan's attempt to shift to smaller, faster ships failed, as these were just as vulnerable to radar-guided attacks. The once mighty shipping network that had sustained Japan's empire was now little more than scattered remnants. The technical side of the campaign was as important as the bravery of the crews. Reliable torpedoes, advanced radar, wolfpack tactics, and precise intelligence combined to create a weapon that Japan had no defense against. What began as a series of isolated attacks in the early war years became, by late 1944, a coordinated and relentless blockade. With each sinking, the noose tightened around the Japanese home islands, and the empire's ability to wage war slipped further away. The night was black and silent over the East China Sea. A heavy fog rolled low across the water, hiding the silhouettes of ships moving slowly toward Japan. In the distance, the faint thrum of engines broke the stillness. A Japanese convoy was on the move, tankers and freighters packed with oil, coal, and food. They sailed in a tight formation, knowing that American submarines were waiting somewhere beyond the horizon. Beneath the waves, 3 U.S. submarines moved into position. Their captains had studied the intelligence reports before leaving port. Codebreakers had revealed the convoy's exact route and timing. Now the submarines waited silently, engines running slow to avoid detection. Inside the cramped control rooms, crews whispered to one another as sonar pings echoed through the hull. The men could feel the tension, each second stretched thin as they crept closer to their prey. Through the periscope, the lead captain spotted the shapes of ships cutting across the water. Tankers formed the heart of the convoy, surrounded by freighters and a handful of small escort vessels. The escorts were little more than converted fishing boats armed with light guns and depth charges. They lacked the speed and equipment of proper destroyers. Still, they posed a threat if they spotted a submarine too soon. The captain gave a quiet order. Torpedo tubes were flooded. Targets were locked in. The submarine eased into firing position, careful not to create a wake that might give it away. When everything was ready, the captain called, "Fire one!" A sharp hiss filled the room as the first torpedo shot forward, followed by another and another. Moments later, a second submarine joined in, then a third, until a spread of torpedoes raced toward the convoy. The night erupted in fire. A tanker carrying aviation fuel took a direct hit, and a column of flame shot into the sky. The explosion lit the water, turning darkness into daylight for a brief, terrible moment. Another torpedo struck a freighter loaded with rice. The ship cracked in two, spilling cargo and crew into the sea. Panic spread through the convoy. Japanese sailors scrambled to man their guns, shouting orders over the roar of explosions. The escorts rushed to respond. Depth charges rolled over the sides, sinking fast before detonating in thunderous bursts. Inside the submarines, lights flickered and equipment rattled as shockwaves slammed the hulls. The crews went silent. Engines were cut. Every man held his breath as the boats slipped deeper into the dark. Silence was survival. Even a dropped wrench or a cough could betray their position. Above, the escorts circled wildly, dropping more charges into the black water. Hours passed in a deadly game of hide and seek. Slowly, the Japanese ships grew frustrated and began to move on, leaving behind a field of wreckage and oil slicks. When the sea finally settled, the submarines rose carefully to periscope depth. The convoy was broken. Fires still burned on the horizon, lighting the faces of sailors floating among the debris. These attacks became routine by late 1944. Japanese shipping lanes were under constant pressure. Every journey carried the risk of disaster. The convoys grew smaller as the merchant fleet dwindled. Tankers were in such short supply that some were forced to sail without escort, an open invitation to attack. The U.S. submarine campaign gained a critical boost after the Battle of the Philippine Sea earlier that year. In that massive clash, Japan lost most of its remaining carriers and hundreds of aircraft. With its air power shattered, Japan could no longer protect its convoys from above. Before the battle, patrol planes had been able to scout ahead, warning convoys of danger. Afterward, the skies belonged to the Americans. Submarines could now operate without fear of being spotted from the air. The fall of islands like Saipan and Guam further tightened the noose. These islands became forward bases for the U.S. Navy, cutting Japan's sea lanes even closer to home. What had once been a long voyage for American submarines now became a shorter, deadlier run. Japan's merchant ships found themselves hemmed in, forced into narrow routes where ambushes were easy to set. As losses mounted, Japan scrambled to defend its remaining shipping. With few destroyers left, the Navy turned to whatever vessels were available. Fishing boats, ferries, and even old civilian freighters were outfitted with guns and sent to sea as escorts. Their crews were often hastily trained, lacking experience or proper equipment. Against radar-guided submarines firing reliable torpedoes, these makeshift escorts stood little chance. In one encounter, a converted trawler managed to spot a periscope and charged in, dropping depth charges as it passed overhead. The explosions rattled the submarine, but the trawler lacked sonar to track it accurately. When it turned back for a second pass, a torpedo struck its side and sent it under in seconds. Every week, the Japanese situation grew worse. Convoy schedules were thrown into chaos. Captains sailed in constant fear, knowing that unseen enemies lurked beneath them. The loss of oil and food began to show at home. Factories slowed production. Warplanes sat idle on airfields with empty fuel tanks. In the cities, rice rations were cut again and again. The submarine crews kept up their relentless pace. After each attack, they slipped away to reload and repair, then returned to the hunt. They operated without glory or recognition, their victories measured in tonnage sunk and resources denied to the enemy. For them, each mission was the same routine: stalk, strike, hide, survive. By the spring of 1945, the Japanese merchant fleet was a shadow of its former self. The once busy sea lanes were now littered with wreckage and oil slicks. Japan's attempts to fight back had failed. Its convoys were no longer lifelines but floating targets, destroyed one after another by submarines that struck from the depths and vanished into the dark. The empire's lifeblood was draining away, and there was nothing left to stop it. By the winter of 1944, life inside Japan's cities was beginning to unravel. Tokyo, Osaka, Nagoya, and Yokohama, once alive with noise and movement, now carried the dull silence of hunger. Rice had become scarce. Families waited in long lines clutching ration cards that bought them less and less each week. What little food arrived by train or truck disappeared as soon as it reached the distribution centers. The government urged people to grow vegetables anywhere they could. Small gardens appeared in empty lots, behind factories, and even on rooftops. Still, these efforts could not match the loss of imported food from Southeast Asia. Mothers boiled weeds and tree bark to stretch meals. Children suffered the most, their ribs visible beneath thin skin. Many collapsed from exhaustion on the way to school or during work shifts in factories. In the countryside, farmers tried to keep up production, but much of their harvest was seized for military use. Black markets emerged in dark alleys and back rooms. There, a handful of rice or a piece of dried fish sold for prices that few could afford. Police raided these markets when they could, but corruption ran deep. Even officials tasked with enforcing ration laws sometimes bought food there to feed their own families. As hunger grew, so did unrest. Quiet resentment spread among the population. People whispered that the Navy could no longer protect the shipping lanes. Rumors of entire convoys being sunk reached the cities, though official reports never admitted the scale of the losses. At night, families huddled around fading lamps, wondering when the next shipment of food might arrive, or if it would come at all. For the military, the situation was no better. Japanese commanders saw their plans unraveling as supplies dried up. Ammunition shipments failed to arrive. Spare parts for planes and vehicles became impossible to find. Even basic medical supplies vanished. In some units, soldiers wrapped wounds with strips of cloth torn from their uniforms because bandages were no longer available. Out on the distant islands where Japanese garrisons were stationed, the collapse was even more severe. These isolated units depended entirely on supply convoys. When the submarines destroyed those convoys, the troops were stranded. Messages sent back to headquarters grew increasingly desperate. Requests for food, ammunition, medicine. Many of these pleas went unanswered. On some islands, soldiers were ordered to survive by living off the land. Where there was no farmland or fresh water, men died by the hundreds. Some groups turned to fishing, hunting, or foraging, but these measures were not enough. Starving soldiers grew too weak to fight. In the final months, entire units simply wasted away, their positions abandoned without a shot being fired. In Japan's higher ranks, anger boiled. Navy officers raged at their inability to protect the convoys. Plans were drawn up for new escort ships and anti-submarine patrols, but there were no resources to build them. Fuel shortages kept planes grounded and ships docked. Even when an escort group was assembled, it often lacked the proper training or equipment. These failures drove home a grim truth. The empire was no longer in control of its own seas. Meanwhile, far below the waves, the American submarine crews faced struggles of their own. Life aboard a submarine was harsh and claustrophobic. The air was stale, heavy with diesel fumes and sweat. The narrow passageways forced men to squeeze past one another in silence. Privacy did not exist. Bunks were shared, with one man sleeping while another worked. Fresh food ran out after the first week, replaced by canned rations that left everyone longing for a real meal. The tension of combat never truly lifted. Every mission meant weeks of being hunted while hunting others. When the order came to dive, the crew scrambled to their stations, listening to the sharp commands of the officers. Depth charges exploded above, shaking the hull like a giant hammer. Each blast could be the one that ended them. Men sat rigid and silent, counting the seconds between explosions, waiting for the next strike. When they surfaced after a successful attack, there was no celebration. The men kept their emotions buried. They knew that the ships they sank carried soldiers and weapons, but sometimes they also carried civilians. Freighters often held laborers, women, or children forced into transport by the war. The crew did not see these faces, but they knew they were there. Some nights, after a convoy had been destroyed, silence filled the mess hall. A few men would eat quickly, then retreat to their bunks. Others sat staring at the bulkheads, wrestling with thoughts they could not speak aloud. Their mission demanded that they sink every ship that aided the enemy's war effort. There was no room for hesitation. Yet beneath the surface of their duty, a quiet unease grew. The submariners carried on because they understood the larger purpose. Each ship they sent to the bottom cut off supplies that would have fueled Japan's armies or fed its factories. They believed their work would shorten the war and save lives in the long run. Still, they felt the weight of what they were doing. By the spring of 1945, the effects of the blockade were visible everywhere. In Japan's cities, hunger became widespread. In the countryside, farmers hoarded what little food they had. In the garrisons scattered across the Pacific, soldiers faced slow death by starvation. And in the depths of the ocean, American submariners pushed forward, knowing their actions were bringing this suffering even as they aimed to bring the war to an end. The human cost of the blockade was immense. It played out in silent kitchens where families went without dinner, in jungle outposts where troops stared at empty supply crates, and in the narrow, steel corridors of submarines where men prepared for another dive. The war was not only fought with guns and bombs. It was fought in the stomachs of those who went hungry and in the minds of those who carried the burden of making others starve. By the early months of 1945, Japan's war machine was collapsing under the weight of the submarine blockade. The effects rippled through every part of the empire. Without steady shipments of coal, steel, and oil, entire factories stood silent. Machines that once built warplanes, tanks, and ships sat idle, covered in dust. Workers reported for duty but were sent home because there were no materials to shape, no fuel to power the machinery, and no food to keep them fed through a full day's labor. Aircraft production, which had once turned out planes by the thousands, fell sharply. With oil supplies nearly gone, even the planes that were built could not be flown. Training flights were canceled because every drop of fuel had to be saved for combat missions. Pilots sat grounded, waiting for orders that never came. On some airfields, rows of new planes rusted in place because there was no gasoline to fill their tanks. Japan's ability to fight in the sky was reduced to scattered, desperate sorties that could not challenge the waves of American bombers overhead. As the blockade cut deeper, Japan became isolated from the territories it had conquered. Its strategy from the beginning of the war had been to expand across the Pacific and Asia, using these regions to supply the resources it lacked at home. Oil from the Dutch East Indies, rice from Southeast Asia, rubber and tin from Malaya. All of it was essential to sustaining the empire's armies and industries. When American submarines severed these supply lines, Japan's strategy unraveled. The empire that had stretched across thousands of miles now became a trap, with its outer possessions cut off and left to wither. Soldiers stationed in the far reaches of the Pacific felt this isolation first. Units on remote islands sent message after message requesting resupply, but their convoys never arrived. The submarines hunted down every ship that tried to reach them. Entire garrisons were abandoned in place, left to survive however they could. Some troops lived on coconuts and rainwater. Others fought each other over scraps of food. By mid-1945, many of these isolated units were no longer capable of organized resistance. They simply waited for the war to end or for death to come. Inside Japan itself, the same story played out on a larger scale. The blockade brought hunger and weakness to the civilian population. Rice rations dropped again and again. Meat vanished entirely from most diets. Mothers carried their children to hospitals only to find there was no medicine to treat them. Malnutrition weakened the population and lowered morale. The government tried to maintain order with propaganda, promising that victory was still possible, but few believed it. Military planners faced the grim truth that they were fighting on empty stomachs. Soldiers in the home islands drilled with wooden rifles because there was no ammunition to spare. Tanks were parked in sheds without fuel. Even basic communication between units began to break down as telegraph lines failed, and there was no equipment to repair them. The U.S. bombing campaign gained strength as Japan's defenses withered. With fewer planes in the sky and little anti-aircraft ammunition, cities were left open to attack. Firebombing raids on Tokyo and other urban centers burned vast swaths of the cities to ash. The destruction was horrific, But what made it even more devastating was Japan's inability to rebuild. Factories that had not been destroyed by bombs still could not operate because there was nothing to feed them. No coal, no iron, no workers strong enough to keep production going. American submarines worked hand in hand with these bombing raids. While bombers struck from the air, the submarines prevented Japan from moving supplies by sea. Any attempt to rebuild a factory or replace a lost shipment of food was met with torpedoes in the dark. The two campaigns reinforced each other, crushing Japan from above and below. The final months of the war were marked by desperation. The military leadership issued frantic orders for new defenses and counterattacks, but they had nothing left to fight with. Reports from the front spoke of units collapsing without contact with the enemy, simply because they had no food or ammunition. Entire divisions melted away as soldiers deserted in search of sustenance. Civilians in the cities felt the same despair. Fires from bombing raids raged unchecked because there was no water pressure to fight them. Trains stopped running when fuel ran out, cutting off what little food could still be moved between regions. People walked for miles to barter for scraps of vegetables. The sound of air raid sirens became part of daily life, a reminder that the enemy controlled the skies and the seas. Japan's leaders understood that they had lost control of their empire. The submarine blockade was not a single decisive battle, but a relentless, invisible campaign. Every sunk tanker and freighter tightened the noose. By 1945, more than 80% of Japan's merchant fleet was gone. Ships that once carried vital cargo now lay at the bottom of the sea. This loss was as decisive as any land battle. Without supplies, there could be no resistance. Even when Japanese troops fought bravely, their efforts were hollow. A rifle without bullets, a plane without fuel, a city without food. These were the realities brought by the blockade. Military analysts after the war would later rank the submarine campaign alongside the atomic bombings and strategic bombing raids in its impact on Japan's defeat. The atomic bombs delivered a sudden, shocking blow. The firebombing of the cities brought destruction on a massive scale. But the submarine blockade worked quietly and steadily, bleeding Japan dry over many months. It ensured that when those final strikes came, Japan was already too weak to stand. By the summer of 1945, the empire that had once seemed unstoppable was hollow and exhausted. Its armies were scattered and starving, its cities burned, its factories silent. The sea, once a pathway for expansion, had become a prison guarded by unseen enemies beneath the waves. The U.S. submarine force had achieved a victory that reshaped the Pacific War, proving that control of the oceans could determine the fate of nations. When the war ended and Japan surrendered, the sheer scale of the submarine blockade came into focus. Harbors that had once been crowded with ships were silent. Rusting hulls lined the docks, many unable to sail for lack of fuel or repair. The ocean, which had been Japan's highway of empire, had become its prison. More than 80% of the nation's merchant fleet lay at the bottom of the sea. It was only then that the world understood how a silent campaign beneath the waves had helped bring about the defeat of an empire. Naval officers studied the records and saw how the U.S. submarine force had dismantled Japan's war machine without ever engaging in a single massive fleet battle. The submarines had acted with precision, cutting one vital artery after another until the entire system collapsed. At the start of the war, unrestricted submarine warfare had been a controversial policy. Many nations had once followed rules that required submarines to warn civilian ships before attacking. But the Pacific War had shown that such restrictions were no longer practical. Japan's economy and military strength depended on a steady flow of imported resources. Without oil, coal, steel, and food, the empire could not survive. The campaign proved that by sinking those ships without warning, a submarine force could achieve a victory just as decisive as any fought with armies or bombers. This realization shaped naval thinking for generations to come. During the early years of the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union examined every detail of the Pacific campaign. The lessons were clear. Control of the seas was not only about battleships and aircraft carriers. It was about the ability to deny an enemy access to vital resources. Submarines were no longer secondary weapons. They became central to national defense. The United States began building a new generation of submarines almost immediately. The old diesel-powered boats were replaced by nuclear-powered vessels. These new submarines could stay submerged for months without surfacing. They moved faster and struck with greater stealth. They carried torpedoes for attacking ships and later added missile systems capable of striking land targets. This transformed the role of submarines from hunters of convoys to strategic tools of global power. The Soviet Union, watching closely, built its own fleet to challenge American dominance. Soviet naval planners feared that, in a future conflict, the U.S. might impose a blockade similar to the one that had starved Japan. To counter this threat, they invested heavily in submarines of their own. The result was a vast underwater arms race. While the world focused on nuclear weapons and missiles, much of the Cold War played out beneath the surface of the oceans, with submarines tracking one another in silent pursuit. For Japan, the legacy of the blockade was deeply personal and painful. While the atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki marked the war's final moments, the slow starvation caused by the loss of shipping had left scars that lasted for decades. Civilians remembered the long lines for rations, the empty shelves, and the nights of listening to their children cry from hunger. They remembered the rumors of convoys lost at sea and the silent dread that followed every report of another sinking. In the years that followed, Japanese society grappled with the memory of this suffering. Writers and filmmakers explored the human side of the blockade, telling stories of families who starved, sailors who drowned when their ships were torpedoed, and soldiers who were left to die on remote islands. These works became part of the national memory, serving as warnings about the costs of over-reliance on imported goods and the vulnerabilities of an island nation. Japan's leaders took those warnings seriously. After the war, they rebuilt their economy with a sharp focus on protecting their trade routes. The nation diversified its sources of raw materials and built up reserves to guard against future disruptions. Diplomatic ties were strengthened with nations along key shipping routes. Even in times of peace, the lessons of the blockade shaped policy. Japanese leaders understood that their prosperity depended on the uninterrupted flow of goods across the ocean. The blockade also influenced global thinking about modern warfare. In military academies around the world, officers studied the Pacific submarine campaign as a case study. They examined how wolfpack tactics had been used to hunt convoys, how intelligence had guided attacks, and how coordinated operations had magnified the effect of each strike. These lessons were applied not only to naval planning but to broader strategies of economic warfare. The campaign showed that a nation's economy could be targeted as effectively as its armies. As technology advanced, the methods of blockade evolved. Modern submarines can do far more than their World War II counterparts. They can track shipping routes with satellites, communicate instantly with command centers, and fire weapons from extreme distances. Some can disable or intercept enemy vessels without sinking them, offering new ways to disrupt trade while avoiding escalation. Cyber warfare has added another layer. Today, a blockade might not involve sinking a single ship. Instead, it might attack navigation systems, shipping databases, or communication networks, paralyzing global trade without a single torpedo being launched. Yet the basic principle remains unchanged. Control the flow of resources and you control the shape of a war. This lesson, first demonstrated in the Pacific, continues to guide modern naval strategy. Nations that depend on imports, such as Japan, South Korea, and many European countries, train constantly to defend their shipping lanes. Their navies patrol sea routes not only to deter piracy but to ensure that no hostile force can cut them off, as Japan was cut off in 1945. In recent decades, international tensions have underscored the importance of these lessons. Conflicts over trade routes, island chains, and territorial waters are often about more than geography. They are about the same lifelines that once carried oil and food to Japan. Modern blockades are discussed in war rooms and diplomatic circles, their roots stretching back to the silent war fought by American submarines beneath the Pacific waves. For the men who served on those submarines, the legacy was personal as well as strategic. Many returned home without public recognition. Their victories had been won in secret, without the dramatic battles that captured headlines. Over time, monuments and museums were built to honor them, and their role in the war became better known. The records of their patrols, once classified, are now studied by historians and naval officers alike. The blockade they carried out was not only a military campaign. It was a lesson in the power of endurance and precision. It showed that wars are not only fought with armies charging across battlefields, but also with quiet, unseen actions that slowly change the course of history. It reminded the world that beneath the surface of the sea, decisions are made that can determine the fate of nations. The echoes of that silent campaign continue to shape military thought, cultural memory, and global strategy even now, long after the last torpedo was fired.